So it's like fictional universes, even westerns, Sergio Leone, we cover.
Sounds like
And now it's your turn. We are doing this month's episode is based on your work. It's a retrospective of your work.
So I think you're rolling. Well, first of all, thank you for being here with us. Thank you for agreeing to this. It's a great honor to have you be able to speak with us to our program. As you said, we are doing a retrospective on your works, every major film you did. And so this conversation is pretty much about your films.
Oh, my pleasure.
So welcome, and Jose.
So I'll go straight to it. First question is this. Your films are all visually very striking, and visually they are very different from one another. The question is, do you think of an aesthetic, something you want to use, and go from there to the narrative? Is it the other way around? The narrative suggests the aesthetics? How is your process?
The narrative usually suggests the aesthetics. So I'll write the script, and then I'll spend a very long time, starting usually with my cinematographer, Kareem Hussein. We'll do this kind of theoretical shot list of the film before we have actors, before we have sets, or we won't even know what country we're shooting, maybe, but it's a good way to talk it through, figure out what equipment to use, and then also develop a kind of visual language and explore the trickery that we can implement there. So, for instance, in Possessor, it was inherent in the narrative that there were kind of two worlds. So, Voss is in these bodies. Sometimes she's living other people's lives, she's living through them, and other times she's in her own life. And so we tried to figure out what would be a visual language that would be not too on the nose, but would help to emphasize that difference. In her own life, she's very uncomfortable. There's a kind of unease and anxiety to it. So you have these domestic scenes that normally would be considered comforting, but to her, they're uncomfortable. So it's all handheld when she's not in someone's body. It's all slightly deeper focus. And just has this kind of harsher quality to it. And then when she goes into a body, there's no handheld, it's all Steadicam and tripod and dolly. It's very shallow depth of field, so it has a kind of dreaminess to it, a traditional, cinematic quality to it. So that's the kind of thing that we'll figure out beforehand. But it's based on the narrative.
Okay.
But from those, so you said you work with your DP, Kareem Hussein from the start, and you establish like a shot list. When you establish that shot list, you already establish like the techniques you want to use, because you have like a very special way of approaching the way you shot films and cut and like the special effects. Do you already know what you want to do beforehand as well when you're discussing with your DP? So
you mean in terms of the sort of hallucinatory elements or
yeah, something like that. Yes, yeah. Because we've seen in some interviews that your short films were like testing grounds for some techniques that you obviously use in the feature films. So that's why I think we discussed that also in the very early process, or it's something that only comes up while you're shooting or while you are already editing it.
I mean, we're constantly doing experiments, so sometimes there might be a good visual idea that actually I'll write to. We'll have some sort of stray. I know I'm contradicting myself, but just for the hallucinatory elements, there might be some camera trick that we've been playing with that just we're excited about, and I'll figure out a way to write it in. Usually, what happens is in the script, there's a hallucinatory moment, so it's a body transfer scene. In Possessor, she's jumping into the body, and there's a kind of vague paragraph that just says, images distort, nightmare images, flashes, whatever. It's, and at this point, that's sort of code for my team to say, we're going to experiment quite a bit and sort of do an experimental short film, but we're going to find it as we go for the most part. So, again, usually that starts with Kareem. We'll spend a lot of time just playing with projection feedback and things that we can put in front of the lens, things we can put behind the lens, try to find ways to distort the image. We bring Dan Martin on, my makeup effects artist for my last two films. And he'll, often we'll talk at length with him, and he'll sort of come up with a menu of, given the budget, I could give you this sort of thing, this sort of thing, this sort of thing. Oh, and I have this great thing in my closet that I wanted to do for a film, and I could bring that out because it's I've always wanted to try it. Well, then we bring our production designer in on Infinity Pool. Zosha McKenzie built these incredible mirror boxes. So, on one side it's two-way. It's a two-way mirror. You can shoot through it into this box without seeing the camera, but on the back of it, it's smart glass, so you can have a wheel of spinning colored Titan tubes that are lights that'll come through the mirror, but you won't be able to see the stand. So it creates this kind of pinwheel effect. And then we shoot just mountains of footage over the course of days and days and days. And then my editor, whoever on Infinity Pool, it was James Vandewater and Matt Hannum on Possessor. Just get this mountain of footage, and then we have to go through culling it, and it's almost like animation at times. Like especially on Infinity Pool with James, we were pairing individual frames. What happens if you put this frame, then this frame, then this frame from totally different shots? What happens if you change the order? There's a kind of an alchemy to frame order that changes what image pops, and so we would just stand there looking at 3 frames at a time and building it that way for a very long time. He somehow didn't kill me.
So it's like you make a film in different stages. Like you write a film, and certain parts of the film are finished when you are in the editing room. It's like some parts you already know what you want to do, and the other parts are very experimental, and you only know the final result when you're actually in the editing room trying everything out. Yeah,
exactly. Some of it is, I might have a very particular image that I want to include from the start, but I really like just finding it with people and having, I try to collect these sort of mad geniuses who just all have a bunch of crazy ideas that they're excited to play with, and then we all get in a room and just start exploring that way.
Because as far as I know, you don't like to rely on blue screen, CGI, and those things. You prefer practical effects.
Yeah, all of those sequences are, all the hallucination sequences in those 2 films are purely practical in-camera effects. There's no CGI. Not that I think CGI is bad, but I think, first of all, in some situations, it is overused. I think for violence, I can understand in some cases, if you want to do one long take that's a huge action scene with no cutting, then it's hard to squib people and do it that way. But I find there's a kind of weight and a texture to the practical effects that that CGI doesn't have. But also, you just don't have that exploratory process. When it's just hands-on with gels and lenses, and you get these happy accidents. You try something, it doesn't quite work, but there's a great visual just for a moment, and that leads you down a path, and then you can find something else that way. And you don't have that with CGI because I can't do it myself, so I'm just handing it off to somebody.
You took 8 years between Antiviral and Possessor. Was it problems with funding, inspiration?
Problems with funding. It was just. And hard to get cast and funding, which are sort of the same thing because you don't get funding unless you have the right cast. So the usual indie problems.
On the note of cast, how do you choose your actors? Because every film always has a different cast, but one that seems unique and ideal for the film. Like the entire cast is like a perfect fit, but it's always different.
I think with a good actor, by the time you're done, it seems like no one else could be in that part. But I never write with an actor in mind because it's just so hard to get any particular actor. I just want to avoid the heartbreak, they're not available, or they don't want to do it, or for some reason no one will let you cast them or whatever. So the process is usually just to find some actor that I'm very excited about. It's not necessarily that they have some sort of great particular quality for the film. It's just, someone who every time I see them in something, they do something really exciting, and they have whatever that hard to articulate thing is that some actors have that is viscerally exciting. And I think if you plug someone like that into a character and give them enough freedom to kind of make it their own, then they're going to do something great and shape it and bring these things to the character. And by the time I shoot, I'm really bored with all my characters because it's usually years and years and years of writing and rewriting and trying to cast. So I want someone who's just going to go and wake the character up for me and Yes, catch me off guard.
Do you still get surprised by the actors?
Oh, all the time. I mean, if anything, I'm casting specifically for people to surprise me because I know in every movie they're going to do something surprising. And also actors are so, they're focused on just that one part. When you're directing, you're trying to focus on everything, but the actors go so deep into just that one very particular aspect. And when they're good actors, they come to you with all this fantastic stuff, and it really, especially if you sort of give them the freedom to bring their artistry into it and to do whatever that thing is that you cast them for, then they can really, really bring you some great stuff and surprise you in positive ways.
In all your films, technology is always a very strong component, and it ends up revealing some very bad aspects of mankind. Is this just a coincidence, or is it something that troubles you? How technology can bring the worst in people?
I actually love technology. I'm not a technophobe or anything like that. I think technology is beautiful and exciting, but I also, I was thinking about anyone who is around my age has lived through a very strange period of human history. It's a little bit like people who lived through the Industrial Revolution, because I was born just before everybody had a computer. I still remember typewriters and rotary phones. And so in every decade of my life, there's been a huge change. Suddenly everybody has computers, then it's the internet, then it's smartphones, and now AI is changing everything again. And I think to be born in 1980 will be looked at as something ridiculous in the way that we can't believe when someone was born at the end of the 1800s, just as all this technology was being developed. So it's maybe for that reason that I feel acutely aware of how technology completely changes how we communicate, how we think. I mean, it's so at the heart of who we are and how we perceive the world. And it can be it can be, of course, horribly dangerous. It can also be beautiful and fantastic and helpful, but it's both. And it's, I think, at the core of who we are now, what we are now. And so there's a dark side to that as well.
It's like almost like your films can be a kind of warning. Look at where we might be going.
Well, but only by accident, though. Because the thing is, they're meant to be satirical, and so a lot of the technology, it's not really meant to be predictive science fiction. They're usually not meant to be. They're not the actual future. They're kind of alternate worlds. For instance, in Possessor, I did a lot of research into brain implants and mind control, and there was this doctor, Jose Delgado, who did this really incredible but sort of sinister brain implant experiments and was able to control people physically and control their behavior. Because of that, I think it is possible that the technology in that film could actually exist eventually, but it would be really far in the future. It's not like anything that we could experience in the near future. And so to build that world would be so removed from modern day reality. But the technology in the film didn't exist to predict the future. It's there to talk about identity and to talk about these other things. And so it's usually designed as this sort of alternate reality, satirical technology for satire purposes, technology for sort of social exploration or thematic technology. But the thing about that is you do stuff that's meant to be a joke and then it becomes real. Like, for instance, it was meant to just be a stupid joke in Possessor. He goes to the office and he puts on a VR headset and then he's experiencing a virtual office. And he's also looking through people's webcams and cataloging really mundane objects in their rooms. That was all meant to be just a stupid throwaway joke, but now it's become real because Meta is forcing people to wear headsets to meetings and to create the virtual offices in this really sort of ridiculous metaverse. And then with AI, you have to train AI to actually recognize these things. So we think it's sort of all done automatically, but actually there are these companies that hire, a massive group of people in Africa, say, to go through people's pictures and identify things. And the AI has to be trained by these huge groups of people. So these companies have people literally doing that job, that incredibly mundane job, saying this is a car, because the AI doesn't know it's a car. It requires people to be trained. So that job, anyways, that job was a joke in the film, but it sort of accidentally became real.
But anyway, you would say that your main interest are the studies on individuality more than the predictive science.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm more interested in, I guess, people and what people are.
How they are affected.
Yeah.
So, apart from festivals, none of your films have ever been released in Portugal. You mentioned that you struggled to find fundings during the antiviral processor. Do you also find it difficult to reach some markets?
Yeah, well, it's hard. It's hard to have any control over that. I mean, you get films financed usually in part, at least on an indie level, by licensing them to, or having a distributor or buy rights for a particular territory, or someone comes in and they buy the film and then their intention is to sell it to different territories. So you usually have a few, like you need a US distributor usually to be able to make a film, and that's like a fair bit of money. But then they have a kind of, someone buys it for the rest of the world, and then it's just kind of up to them to figure out who they license it to, and so yeah. I didn't even know that none of my films came out in Portugal because no. Well, I'm glad to
Okay, because we know that it's a niche, right? It's either science fiction or horror is always a niche when we're talking about indie filmmaking.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, in recent years we've seen like a great acceptance of horror cinema, not only like on festivals but on the more mainstream circuits, with films enjoying great commercial success and others being accepted by more traditional critics, such like films at Cannes. Do you see this change as something that perhaps will be benefit for indie filmmakers in the horror or science fiction genre as yourself?
I think so. I mean, horror is one of those genres that usually sells in some way or another. Like it's a pretty, we're going through a weird phase in terms of theatrical releases, because I think it's only horror and superhero movies for the or Star Wars. It's like horror in terms of a movie that you can make for under $200 million. It's sort of a horror movie or nothing in terms of what's going to get a very broad commercial release these days. Although that said, there's a lot of interest in, I think it's like a pretty good time for horror generally, because if you look at, say, what Neon are doing or what A24 are doing, I think there's this interest in less traditional horror, not necessarily just very mainstream horror, that's becoming more commercially viable and more interesting. So, I think it goes in and out of fashion, maybe.
Okay, that's cool.
So I think we are finishing. A question: what kind of question would you like to be asked that you were never asked when you're talking about your movies?
That's not that question. That's a very good question, but a very hard question.
In a way, it's another way to ask if you feel that in interviews people are grasping your work, or they just asking something else that you don't want to talk about.
Right. I mean, it just varies. You guys are obviously very geeky about films, and so it's good to do that kind of interview, and then you get some people who aren't, and it's sort of the less interesting interview. But I don't know. I wish I had a good answer for that question.
So maybe final one. Could you name a few horror movies that influenced you and that are that you would like to recommend to people if they are less known, of course?
Right, that is the one other question that I'm terrible at. My mind just goes blank. I'm sorry, do you have one other question? Yeah, I have no, for some reason have a neurological...
a complicated one that is, now that horror becomes to be more talked about everywhere, even in festivals such as Cannes and so on. What do you think of the concept of elevated horror that some people are trying to implement these days?
Elevated horror, I think, is just a marketing gimmick, and I don't really think it means anything. I think mainstream audiences have a conception of horror that it's just the Conjuring universe or paranormal activity or these kinds of things. And so from a marketing perspective, it might be useful to say everything else is elevated horror. If it's more artful horror, they like to give it a name because then they can help sell it. But it doesn't mean anything. I mean, if you look at the history of the genre, it's incredibly thoughtful and artful, and it's not, there's nothing elevated about it. It's just horror. But if it helps people, sell more interesting horror movies, then fine. But I think we all know as horror people that it's a meaningless term, really.
Well, just one final question: do you think Lisbon will suggest you any horror film?
I mean, I've heard there's a lot of film shooting here, and actually, I had a really. I had a moment of aesthetic inspiration just since I've been here, but I don't want to talk about it yet because it might not ever happen. But I mean, the country and the architecture is incredibly aesthetic and unique, and so I have an idea. I'll let you know if anything comes of it.
Good to know. Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much for
Thanks so much.
being with us. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.